This is gonna be a weird one, folks. Strap in. The more you think about Gorillaz, the more it becomes perplexing how long they have sustained a career. What was once a side project for Damon Albarn of the Britpop band Blur, inspired by watching the fugue state of late 1990s MTV and wanting to make a manufactured band but make it kind of interesting, they now have as many albums as Blur did, arguably more recognizable outside of the UK. They were not the first virtual band. You can argue Alvin and the Chipmunks were in the late 1950s, Grammy award-winning, I might add, followed by the Archies in the late 60s, and a whole slew of them linked to cartoons in the decades that would follow, including a ton out of Japan linked to idol culture and popular anime franchises like Macross, where you can see the long lineage of VTubers today, but Gorillaz felt different. The combination of artist Jamie Hewlett's jagged visuals with Damon Albarn's weirder genre experimentation that he felt that he couldn't get away with within Blur. You know, reggae, dub, Latin music, world music, hip-hop, the sort of material where he would get the side eye if he was performing that live on stage. But a virtual, multi-ethnic band of cartoon weirdos, that could sidestep any critique. Granted, this was the late 90s, and there were all sorts of oddballs leaping across genres with deconstructive abandon, which seems to have been weirdly forgotten by way too many people, especially when acts like Beck got huge critical acclaim and feel almost written out of rock history now. But Damon Albarn was smart enough to recognize that side project might have longer legs if he was performing behind that virtual face. And he was right. But it's damn near 30 years later, and Gorillaz is still releasing music. In fact, to younger generations, you could argue that the cartoon faces of 2D, Noodles, Murdoc, and Russel, they're more recognizable than Damon Albarn's face himself. I would argue that Gorillaz feel like a singular entity in mainstream music. There are more virtual bands and creations now than ever before, especially if you look at the success of K-pop Demon Hunters, which they really want to franchise, and especially with the rancid and derivative poison of AI artists. But you know, nobody quite sounds like Gorillaz, and others certainly don't have the clout to bring in the robust stable of guest features that they can wrangle on a regular basis. They've never quite matched their commercial peak in the mid-2000s, but they certainly have that cult fan base and enough crossover singles on every playlist that it cultivates a great vibe. When I was in university in the late 2000s, every stoner, every raver I knew had a Demon Days poster in their room, and I really couldn't blame them. That's a fantastic album. They certainly had their peaks and valleys with their music, but I wouldn't argue their massive appeal, especially if you want to hear about the exploits of that digital band. There's a whole meticulously curated fan wiki that has chronicled their long, tangled story from before the self-titled album now to the mountain. And that's the lore that I want to explore today, or rather, what the lore might be trying to do. Fair warning, this all might be a little contentious, but again, this is not a review. Welcome to Spectrum Pulse, where we talk about music, movies, art and culture, and the empty lore, or rather the hollow lore, of Gorillaz. So, defining lore, which according to Merriam-Webster is the space between the eye and bill of a bird or the corresponding region in a reptile or fish. The adjective being L'Oreal, not L'Oreal, that's the hair care line. Okay, bad jokes aside, lore is easy enough to define, but it's got layers. It's a body of knowledge, oft associated with tradition, something that is learned or taught. Accumulated knowledge, and the link often to tradition implies history, lineage, fundamentally backwards looking. You could call it backstory. It's almost so simple that defining it feels a little bit ridiculous here. Don't overthink it. But that's an adage that Gorillaz has run on for a very long time. And I think it kind of sidesteps both what lore is and what lore does, both in terms of storytelling and larger theme. So let's start by asking that hard question. What does the lore of Gorillaz do? Well, before we get into all that, let's talk about what's actually in the lore of Gorillaz. Because if you're just listening to the music, you probably don't know a lot of what I'm going to tell you, and fair warning, it is a lot. I'm not going to chronologically re-summarize the fan wiki, which is built from the sprawling universe of music videos, interviews with the band, augmented reality websites, published semi-canonical fan backstory, and extrapolation of which I'm only half certain can really be supported. There is a lot of retcons in all this, mostly surrounding the events about Plastic Beach. Keep in mind that the story arc of Gorillaz as a virtual band implies that all of this could have happened to a band at some point. And a lot of this would be wild even by the most cartoonishly, pardon the pun, over-stylized rock documentaries. So here's a rough list of that. That also excludes how Damon Albarn actually exists in the Gorillaz universe, but is not technically a part of Gorillaz. At least 4 different radio shows or podcasts. 6 arrests, mostly Murdoc's fault. 2 car accidents, well, at least 2. At least 2 kidnappings. 1 charge of arson for the insurance money. Murdoc's fault again. 1 jetpack for Noodle. 1 instant of 2D trying to go to law school. Turned out not to be his thing. That should not be surprising. 1 very obvious Charles Manson reference in a cult. Yes, you can blame Murdoc for this too, and he may have been doing all this in order to impress a girl who is leading another cult. My god, Cracker Island was a mess. At least 6 presumed instances of summoning or possession, demonic or otherwise. At least 2 journeys into hell. 1 rejected horseman of the apocalypse named, and I'm not kidding, Flatulence. 2 Powerpuff Girl crossovers, 1 involving mutant monkeys sent to space, then coming back to Earth. 1 government super soldier program. 1 kidnapping of Russel by the North Korean regime, which due to his immense size, ties to events in Plastic Beach, became known as their Godzilla named Paul Gassari. 1 boutique hot sauce business, also run by Russel. 1 cyborg cloning incident done to Noodle by Murdoc, again tied to Plastic Beach. Cyborg Noodle then gets shot in the head in an encounter with Bruce Willis. Insert confused discourse about the entire Cyborg Noodle arc, how much abuse she suffered in this band, especially early on. It's comical, honestly in retrospect a little bit gross. Let's not try to dwell on that. Actually, let's just talk about the entire arc of Plastic Beach involving paramilitary organizations, giant whales, and a thing called the Boogeyman, of which there's controversy in the 2020 Song Machine arc because there are videos that are set on Plastic Beach that may or may not have been staged because of how that island fell apart at the end of that arc. If you're paying that much attention to the continuity, you might be missing the point. 1 episode of MTV Cribs. Kids, ask your parents about MTV's Cribs. Then ask your parents about MTV. 1 crossover, and it's no joke here, with another virtual band happening with the Archies and apparently Murdoc fighting Jughead at a house party in LA. Why didn't that show up in Riverdale? And finally, 1 incident of 9/11. Actually very relevant to discussing the mountain. Believe it or not, we're gonna have to come back to it. Now, I'm listing all of this intentionally out of order, largely for comedic effect. Occasionally I can be funny, in order to make a very specific point, where I don't envy anybody trying to seriously keep track of the Gorillaz canon or plot. Shout out to Self-Titled Productions, who did an hour-plus video attempting to summarize that continuity. It was an interesting watch going into this, because you can tell that the masterminds behind the band themselves are only incidentally concerned with that continuity, and you can argue increasingly less so in recent years. And you can excuse a lot of this because they're a cartoon band, and the utterly wacky shenanigans that take place semi-seriously correlates with how a lot of bands do their myth-making and their marketing. They want to describe their wildest exploits, true or otherwise. Or at least they did before the internet demystified so much of it, and some of them still try to this day. Or you can say that all this is just over-the-top stylization because you can get away with your band being a largely irreverent parody of rock band and excess, especially coming out of the Britpop era, that bizarrely seems to skirt around the vast majority of sex and drugs that a lot of rock bands of that era actually did, and all the deranged silliness that can touch on the working reality of being a musician, and the twisted record label dealings, and a semi-apocalyptic framing that at least dates as far back as Demon Days. Again, it's a cartoon. You're not supposed to take it that seriously. There was a time you didn't have to take it seriously. Just consider each album an anthology arc of this band's wacky adventures. And while that argument might seem undercooked on the surface, I actually think it holds more water than one might think, which can be one of the great advantages of this sort of lore building. If you're a casual fan of Gorillaz, you probably did not remember everything that I just mentioned before, but I bet at least a few of you alt-tabbed over to look up at least one of the things that I mentioned, because it's just so out there and strange, your curiosity takes over, that there has got to be some sort of explanation as to what the hell happened or why. It's a great storytelling mechanic in order to hook your audience, because in setting up a world where interesting things will have happened, it presupposes that the new story that Gorillaz tells with each album will be even more interesting, because that's the story they're telling now. Because lore is most often not the story. It's a little like the old definition of the Force from Star Wars: A New Hope. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, it binds the galaxy together, and will often be retconned with overcomplicated minutiae and a lot of odd political overtones to explain something that really did not need that added explanation. It precedes the story. It helps set up the stage. It may come from previous stories, but it's built in order to flesh out that background. Depending on your genre of storytelling in art, hell, depending on your genre of art, lore can be extremely important for the audience, especially if you're asking them to care about a set of characters that might be intriguing on the surface, but might need a little further depth as the story continues. You run into a lot of this if you write fiction, like I do, but one specific place where I encounter all this all the time, it's in a game like Dungeons & Dragons. I mean, full disclosure, in case if it's not abundantly obvious, I'm a huge nerd. I've been either playing in or running games off and on for about 20 years now, including an ongoing campaign where I'm nearly 2 years and 60 plus sessions in. And it's relevant because one element you grapple with as a dungeon master, it is lore. You don't want to overwhelm your players with backstory and history and every minute detail of the setting, but you need enough in order to create the atmosphere, deepen your non-player characters, flesh out the cultures of the world you're building, and the history from whence those cultures came. It's a balancing act, and I've been guilty of giving both too much and too little here. In the former case, where you just overwhelm your players with all the information, but in the latter, you don't really engage them beyond the broad mechanics, and that can lead to a pretty limited, often pretty short game. But it's not just me as the dungeon master with lore here. There's a huge tradition of players creating their own lore and backstory when they make their characters, imagining their own side characters and history before they reach the story that you as the dungeon master is helping them tell. Now, this can also be a balancing act. There are few things better as a DM than integrating an element of your player's backstory into the story you're now telling. And not only do you get that pop of recognition, but also deepening the collective imagination in which we're all playing the game. But at the same time, sometimes you gotta be willing to draw a line with your players, sometimes because their lore doesn't quite intersect with the mechanics of the world you've built, sometimes because it doesn't feel realistic to the character that they themselves have created. Case in point, if your character is starting off on their first adventure and they're at level 1, you can have a tragic layered backstory, but how much of that really feels plausible for what your character might have done to actually create that? Relatively inexperienced as an adventurer. It's the reason why a lot of DMs have their players start off as a slightly higher level. It gives their players a lot of room to add a little bit more to their backstory and that lore that would make sense with a lot of their skills. Allows them to flesh out more of their own story. Gorillaz largely short-circuit that process. The cartoon heightening of unreality and infusion of fantastic fantastical elements, make it very clear they're not concerned with power level, and a famous virtual band has considerably more resources than your starting D&D party in a campaign. But even then, the fact that they are a band with a mercurial at best character like Murdoc tied up with record label contracts does attempt to introduce some grounding elements in the setting and the lore that surrounds them. And as a creator, look, I'm not going to deny that creating lore and backstory is a ton of fun. You can clearly tell that at every stage around every album, the artist, musical, and visual around Gorillaz try to make the most of that distinctive identity and that flair, pushing the bounds of your imagination, where they have even more flexibility given they're working with a cartoon. Anything's possible. Beyond just the visual impact of character creation and tabletop role-playing games to construct your unique avatar, imagining the history and backstory that might have shaped that character into who they are, the limits stretch as far as your imagination can go. There will be some constraints, but creativity without limitation, in my experience, doesn't feel that rewarding. I think Damon Albarn might agree. Case in point, I remember an old exercise a DM I had as a teenager put his players through, where he tasked us to build any character at any level that we wanted. And all of us initially tried to create the most ridiculously powerful characters that we could, and we tried to imagine the world in which they made sense. And yet, as the exercise went on, hour after hour, we found ourselves scaling back, because for all the lore that we were spinning, if all the most interesting conflicts and struggles occurred to make your character this overpowered self-insert before the game even happened, what would be the point of playing the game? It's an old storytelling adage that you want your narrative to occur at the most interesting point of your characters' lives. Because if not, why aren't you telling that story? It's a limiting adage in my opinion, because I might be looking to tell, let's say, a deconstructive story about the impacts of those interesting times before or after, or to make a point about relative normalcy, or tell more of a sociologically driven story where the characters aren't always as important, but that's getting into the weeds and the exceptions, not the rule. Now, all this becomes very relevant when discussing how an act can control scope in their narrative, which is something that you can tell post-Plastic Beach, Gorillaz has kind of really struggled to reset any sense of scale, any sense of stakes. Once you bring in paramilitary organizations and going to hell, you can't really go back from that easily. And the reason I'm on this tangent is because lore is backstory, but rarely makes for great narrative itself. At this point, we've all experienced art, be it a book or comic or movie or video game, where it feels like you're reading or watching or playing through someone's lore dump rather than a fresh story, where there's a great mythos and annals of grand history, and on the surface it feels huge and overwhelming, and sometimes on sheer epic scope it can be enough, but more often than not you find yourself lost, or frustrated, or confused, especially if the main narrative doesn't wind up all that engaging with the story you're trying to tell in comparison with your lore. More often than not, I have bailed out of a fantasy novel that would rather bog itself down in grand lore for the setting rather than tell a story with interesting characters that can talk to each other. Or worse still, when you can tell an author would rather build lore around one specific character rather than have them evolve or grow, especially if they have to introduce retcons to do so. C1 Duerden Drizzt. If you know, you know. This has also been somewhat true with Gorillaz. You can tell where certain characters have become fan favorites or sold more merch in a given album run, thus they become the focus in some of the lore to the detriment of everyone else. I've seen stories get subsumed by their own lore, crushed underfoot by underthought inconsistencies. I've seen stories that only seem to work if you've engaged with all of the lore, and they might wind up resonant by virtue of Stockholm Syndrome, but at the end can leave you thinking, was all that really worth it? If you get to the end of that list of things that happened in and around Gorillaz that I mentioned, and then I thought, wow, that's cool, but it also kind of sounds exhausting, Well, you see my point. I've seen movie franchises lose the plot entirely because producers get hung up on an incidental piece of lore that they want to put at the forefront, which utterly cripples the mood or narrative flow or theme. I can count at least 3 characters in Gorillaz lore where that became at least a major factor. If you want Gorillaz examples, I'll give you Cyborg Noodle, My God the Mess There, the Boogeyman, the Entertainment Internal Affairs, the Evangelist, and whatever the hell El Mierda was supposed to be. My God, the whole run of the Now was a mess too. But what bothers me the most here, and this might step on some toes, are those who limit their creative expression to lore and lore alone. You see a lot of this with the creation of digital avatars, pit crews, those who only play the game for the character creation and then bail out, where you can tell the creative process is limiting itself to an idealized character rather than do anything with said character. You see this a lot in RPG spaces, where players love the process of building their character. Well, you will find people who will talk endlessly about the characters that they built that are so cool. They explore one specific style, one very distinct niche lane, but actually playing it? Not so much. Hilariously, you see a lot of this with the whole min-max crowd who love to create an incredibly overpowered creature within the bounds of the rules, and honestly, I'm fine with them coming to the table with that character, because no plan survives contact with the enemy, and all that fine-tuning crumbles when facing the reality of a world with different consequences, physical or social. Hell, that's applicable to real life. Someone please tell the United States government that as they embark on the next forever war. There seems to be a very protective instinct around these characters, and one that, in all due fairness, I don't want to dismiss out of hand. You can put a lot of yourself into these sorts of creation, even more so a character that might be representative of yourself. An avatar. I don't restrain this to just TTRPGs. I think about Gorillaz as a whole here. And telling a good story requires you add stakes and conflict where that character might come to harm, and by extension, you might feel the weight of it. I've seen players cry when their characters die or suffer grievous harm. I can't even blame them for it. I defend fanfiction a lot, not just because I wrote 1,000,000+ words of it, and I absolutely fell prey to over-designed lore in my teenage years, but I think one of the reasons that fanfiction fundamentally gets disparaged, especially by some authors, is how a lot of it's just wish fulfillment and lore, obsessed with minutia and backstory without the stakes or themes to really say something deeper, challenge the characters further, original or otherwise. Now, of course, this can be just as true with any piece of fiction or genre entertainment, just with added refinement and the prestige of a publisher, but my larger point is that storytelling, themes, they're hard. Writing lore, well, it's a lot like being a critic. Everyone thinks they can do it, especially online. Few are that good at it. But here's where all this runs into a much more tangled conversation, because I've talked a lot around lore and narrative, but if you're predominantly a fan of the music of Gorillaz, aka the vast majority of people, you might be hearing some of the wild shit for the first time that I'm describing here. You might be inclined to look back at the lyrics of Gorillaz albums and wonder, wait, was all this there the first time and I just didn't pick up on it? Or you might be thinking, why didn't I hear about any of this in the actual reviews that you as a critic made about these albums? And I'm here to say that you're not crazy, nor wrong. Because for as much as I might talk about lore and narrative in the Gorillaz universe and continuity, at some point you gotta get back to the music, which is the primary way people engage with them, and is considerably less narrative driven. And for Gorillaz, we all kind of known and accept that. It's not that the visuals aren't impressively distinct or idiosyncratic. Jamie Hewlett's done a frankly ridiculous job creating such a distinctive visual style for Gorillaz, a language that's lasted over 20 years, or that they're not saying something to deepen the artistic experience. But they can also seem to operate on a parallel plane of existence in comparison with what Damon Albarn is creating in his lyrics, and then drawl singing through them, especially when he brings on so many guest features and verses into the kitchen who may not know nor care about Gorillaz' backstory. And let's hope they might get the themes. Hell, early on, Gorillaz got a lot of dismissive flack from a lot of well-meaning critics for being considered more of a gimmick. All weed smoke and paranoid ramblings attached to a cartoon that you were never supposed to take that seriously. This is around the same era as the whole extended universe behind Eiffel 65. Or if you're Canadian and remember the virtual joke band Prozac created the same year as Gorillaz. Or hell, every attempt for a music video director in order to create continuity for an artist across multiple videos. It immediately raises the question how seriously you're going to take all the lore around a musical artist, given that the lore is not the main focus. And to narrow that focus here, I'm going to be generous and put all the acts that explicitly weave the story into the narrative. That's a different group. It's borderline theatrical. There are so many acts that set up a self-contained story specifically to drive an arc from track to track on an album. The easiest example, I Remember You Was Conflicted. Misusing your influence. I mean, that's different than acts like Gorillaz that specifically frame their albums as more a loose thematic exploration, less linear or tied to characters, more capturing a vibe or poetry where the lore is more to paint out the atmosphere. You can sidestep a lot of narrative frustrations by doing this, where you don't really have to care that deeply about continuity or character development. Not saying it doesn't happen, but in the poetry of an album as a self-contained piece of media, you can sidestep a lot of the awkward questions how much any of this matters or makes sense. It's more incidental to creating the atmosphere rather than driving the narrative focus and being more streamlined. The increasingly gimmick-driven rock acts like Ghost or Sleep Token, they have made bank playing to this formula. And honestly, it's kind of the sweet spot to be in. The casual fans who are only going to stick with the music, maybe appreciate some cool visuals or ideas along the way. The diehard fans can get in the weeds trying to extrapolate, this is what 2D was feeling when he sung this song on record, with the rest of the visuals playing out like a semi-silent film behind him, with the additional promotional material and interviews letting other characters, usually Murdoc, punch in some vocals of his own. And you know what? It'll be the diehard fans who get in the weeds about continuity, but they are also going to be the ones to give the band the most grace, and they're going to mark out the hardest when there are callbacks to that continuity, where lore can do a lot of heavy lifting to keep them engaged. And Gorillaz has proven you can be extremely successful in this, to say nothing of influential. Throughout the past 30 years, how often have we seen acts draw on visual continuity for music videos or their eras that haven't only really feel peripheral to what they're saying in the music at its core, and based off the emotional connection to that music, you start buying into the rest of the attendant artwork around it. Maybe even buying merch based off of the era and iconography you like or identify with the most. Don't think the music industry has not taken notice of this, or recognize that the mystique can come with the serialization of symbolism. I mean, the most popular tour in the world kind of nailed this. But the critic is kind of in between both worlds. They might be in the realm of the casual listener where they see all the lore and trappings that at the end of the day doesn't seem to really matter that much. Or if they are digging in with a closer lens, more reserved for the diehard fans, they're going to be the ones to highlight some of those weird discrepancies. Or where the tone of the imagery and storytelling in and around said lore barely seems to align with the actual music. This is where I could start getting truly obnoxious and start pointing out plot holes or lapses in continuity. I mean, 2D went to the Himalayas in the lead up to Humans. There was no mention of that in their disjointed travel to India for The Mountain, while there are other very obvious callbacks in that long-form animated music video that even by the wild logic of Gorillaz' whole extended universe, they probably should not be in India. But truthfully, that is missing the point. In the psychedelic and semi-surreal soundscapes of this cartoon band operates more on mood and tone. You're just supposed to let it all wash over you, man. You need to meet the art where it is. Now, this is where a lot of psychedelic art tends to get the blanket pass for things not exactly making that much intellectual sense, a pass that Gorillaz has had for decades now. But if you're in direct reference to some of that lore and occasionally wanting to say something with it, draw upon the heartstrings with it, that's going to be a balancing act, and it's going to get pushed to the brink.
Open the door. Can you hear the drum?
I guess I have to talk about The Mountain a little here, because it is the point where some of that tension reaches a new apex. Yes, pun intended. Unlike the Now Now or Cracker Island that tried to engage a little bit more heavily with the narrative in their promotion post-Gorillaz reunion, The Mountain falls in the lane that's closer to Humans or Song Machine, in that it's overflowing with all the guest features and seems to circle around a rather loose collection of themes rather than tell more of a narrative story, at least in a lot of the visuals that have been released thus far. This is another point where, quite frankly, my job as a critic gets messier, because in order to be timely in discussing this album and putting this whole video out, we gotta skip over the fact that more music videos or visuals will be released in order to accompany The Mountain, especially on tour. Gorillaz have done that before. They might add more narrative depth. I'm not sure it's going to be the case. They've already released 5 singles starting back last September, but it is worth calling out. It's also worth mentioning how Jamie Hewlett has described The Mountain as a metaphor. To quote, "The mountain is a metaphor for life. The bottom of the mountain is vast, with many green jungles and many paths, many opportunities, and the higher you climb, the more narrow it becomes. And if you make it to the top of that mountain, what is beyond that?" And that is essentially reincarnation. I mean, it's an interesting metaphor to deconstruct. It frames life as the constant struggle to climb that mountain, also echoing how Damon Albarn believes that the artistic process should be difficult in order for that labor to give it meaning, one of his points in contention against AI art, where we all inevitably reach the same shared endpoint. And from a metatextual point of view, it can be very telling as a creator to feel like you have struggled. You've also written yourself into a corner at the very top of that mountain with all the lore behind you, where despite the broad swath of stories you may have crafted for your creations, inevitably you reach the crux point where it all comes together, and then you might have to move on. You can't ignore how mortality hangs over the album, because both Hewlett and Albarn recently experienced the deaths of their fathers. They're both in their late 50s. That's the sort of thing that'll shake and haunt you deeply at that age. Musing over that's all over the album. It sets up the possibility that Gorillaz might be sunsetting this as a project, and it would make sense. They've now put out more projects since they reunited than when they went on hiatus after the 2000s. The stories are wild, but they feel increasingly diffuse. Often when acts make long, star-studded musings on death, they're preparing for a certain finality. I certainly understand why some are calling this their best since Plastic Beach. There is a finality to it, but I don't exactly think that's high praise. Mostly, to put it bluntly, Gorillaz hasn't been that good since Plastic Beach, and I'm not even the biggest fan of that album, and this is coming from the seeming contrarian that likes Humans way more than most. I go back to what Damon Albarn has said about Gorillaz has allowed him to explore specific genres of music where he may have gotten odd looks if it wasn't explicitly tied to this virtual band project, which has taken him all over the world since, from North America to Africa to Central Asia and now India. He might want to avoid the comparisons made of certain British rock acts traveling to India to refresh their inspiration, like the Beatles did in the late 1960s, or Ed Sheeran did just last year, only while in India to coincidentally wander into the same shop that sold George Harrison his first sitar decades ago. Although it would not surprise me if a number of sitar salespeople in India might tell the same story if a multi-millionaire musician wandered in. I wouldn't even blame them for it. Because there were some hints of cynicism that crossed Albarn's mind in the recording of The Mountain. The Happy Dictator was sparks. It was partially inspired by some of his travels in Turkmenistan, where all bad news was banned by the dictator there, of which Albarn had conflicting emotions. We'll come back to that. But he also described going to an ashram in India in order to meet with a guru, and that guru had already researched them in advance, and the visit wound up broadcast across television in India. So naturally, they made the song The Plastic Guru in response. And the long-form music video of a different song features a guru literally selling snake oil. Now this is noteworthy because Gorillaz has routinely had a bit of a semi-anti-establishment bent for whatever the establishment tends to be, but reading through the purposefully abstracted lyrics, you can tell Albarn has long been more focused on populism than any sort of precision or power in his commentary. It's not exactly focused enough to leverage any commentary on those who might exploit those who are hunting for transcendence. There's no systemic glimpse behind the curtain, to say nothing of modern Indian politics. And no, I don't really expect that with Gorillaz. I look back at Plastic Beach and Demon Days, those were decades ago. But it indicates a weird myopia that persists across the project, where for as broadly as Albarn paints the themes, you can hear the limitations. It's why the Happy Dictator can intentionally hit such a jarring note, because it is dystopian to control news and information, but wouldn't it be nice for him, Damon Albarn, to not see bad news about the world, just be able to disconnect? Wouldn't you want that too? Hell, maybe some of that also comes with me not being the biggest fan of this awkward fusion of sounds. With a more robust and developed Hindustani instrumentation mashed into Damon Albarn's goopy psychedelia, reggaeton, afrobeats, and synthpop, with a bizarrely jovial tone given what it's going through, especially in the album's kookier up-tempo first half. I mean, I respect craft, but when you're not always wild about some of the tonal choices, they're not bad, they just don't really move me the way I would hope, and Albarn's synths and drums have been really missing a lot of that tangible grit for way too long, all the more pronounced by getting James Ford in order to punch up the cinematic gloss and strings to the point of almost treading into camp and theater territory. The album sprawls under its own weight, where the emotional drama, at its core, it could potentially carry it, but many winding misadventures kind of blunt that cutting blow. This could have easily been a lot more focused. So let's talk about the elephant in the room. In a quote that Damon Albarn gave to Rolling Stone, I just thought, if we're going to talk about the subject of death, I need some people who are dead to help me talk about it. Which is why across this album you're going to hear snippets from many a late artist from sessions or sampling that Albarn has collected over the past couple of decades. The one that's gotten the most attention is a whole verse from Proof, the late Detroit rapper of D12, dating back to sessions around 2001 where they were stranded due to 9/11 for the song The Manifesto. It's a good verse. It does not remotely fit on the album, nor make all that much sense in context. I'm not even sure it works in the song itself, especially alongside Truno's rapping in Spanish. I got no idea how Eminem might feel to hear a verse from his longtime childhood friend now showing up here, which is a similar question I have for the other members of De La Soul in order to hear snippets of Dave punching in alongside Black Thought on The Moon Cave. I mean, it would be a little jarring. I wonder if Albarn mentioned it to them at all, if he cared to. The late singer Bobby Womack is on The Moon Cave too, and it goes beyond it. Mark E. Smith, formerly of The Falls on Delirium, one of my favorite songs here because of its wild, groovy abandon. Late actor Dennis Hopper contributes some mutterings on The Mountain and the opening title track. And when Lou Reed's estate refused to let Albarn use any of his voice in music, he took Reed's words and recorded them himself through a voice synthesizer. Naturally for the Plastic Guru, and I'm sorry, that feels out of pocket. Not good. Now, I've notably come out pretty strongly against the vast majority of posthumous releases, but I will hear the case that on an album encircling endings and death and whatever might come next, There is proof of this being done somewhat well. Look at the Avalanche's fantastic late 2020 album, We Will Always Love You, which has only grown more resonant with time and the more music history I have learned, especially around the late Karen Carpenter and David Berman and how their contributions fit with that project. But on The Mountain, it would imply a level of structural or tonal consistency that Gorillaz doesn't really muster that effectively, which also bizarrely makes a certain amount of sense, because grief does not have structure nor tonal consistency. You cry, you feel numb, you try to distract yourself to move on, you find yourself laughing at odd moments that ring off a little too loud, and then you feel really weird because of it, and you cry again. And as such, well, I've said this over the course of years now, sometimes you can connect with that grief and it's just going to rip your heart out every single time. And sometimes as the audience, you're left in a shifting morass where observing it, it just doesn't connect as strongly as you might hope. Especially in a performative medium where the arc of your characters doesn't really seem to align with the emotions and circumstances the creators behind Gorillaz felt. Not saying they aren't a similar ballpark or couldn't represent some of that odd dissonance. I mean, it'd be flat out wrong to say that the characters in Gorillaz have not experienced real character growth and change going back to the self-titled album, even if it's more abstracted than a lot of conventional narrative. The biggest changes coming from Murdoc, going from the manic, borderline abusive and debauched band mastermind and anti-hero to a more pensive member of a more collaborative band who have seemingly forgiven some of his past transgressions against them. An album like this, where Gorillaz travel to India in order to muse on reinvention and reincarnation, as they see a lot of the ghost around them, where Albarn and Hewlett, they try to process their own grief. Look, there may not be a mirrored continuity to their experience, but there are parallels in the emotional through line that I respect. But how much you're able to engage with those parallels feels a bit like a moving target, and it can be driven off of performance and execution. There's always going to be some weird humor and tonal incongruities with Gorillaz. That's kind of been part of the territory from the jump. You're not supposed to take it that seriously until you are, because it's tugging on the heartstrings of memory and nostalgia you've had for this band you've been exploring along the way. And it's all done with hand-drawn animation with a legacy that goes back even further than the inception of the band, which many have celebrated as a deliberate pushback against AI video generation, when this could have all been generated cheaply and easily, but missing a lot of that soul. There's a very real irony of Gorillaz being a assembled cartoon band meant to deconstruct the process of how such bands and acts were built, take the piss out of all the lore and myth-making of rock, now outlasting so many of those rock acts, and themselves leaning into the tangible sincerity, where the deconstruction swings back around to reconstruct something but in their image, retracing similar steps of musicians past as the weight of their lore looms around them. And look, they've done this before. Look at Plastic Beach. But when there's even less on the record to interweave with the visuals that want to evoke some of that past connection, has you wondering how much Gorillaz might just be the framework that gives Damon Albarn a winsome, globe-trotting, psychedelic pop outlet. Does he care about 2D and Murdoc and Noodles and Russel stories? Or is it just background? Backstory? Lore, even as one of his next projects is scoring an upcoming movie based around OpenAI and Sam Altman, as he criticizes their entire business venture. I mean, I got a lot of thoughts there, but make of it what you will. We'll have to see. You know, it's worth highlighting the imagery in that long-form, hand-drawn music video spanning the mountain, the moon cave, and the closer, the sad god. No actual ascent occurs going up the mountain, but the descent into a spectral cave, the ferryman taking them across a vast swath of water, and one by one watching the members of Gorillaz jump off the boat, leaping into the depths, and Murdoc being the most hesitant, but ultimately following with the rest of the band. I mean, potentially it is another metaphor for experiencing death in the unknown, but it also could be an escape from passing over and reincarnating just yet. Because, of course, that's what they're going to do. Gorillaz aren't done just yet. I'm not surprised they are hedging their bets here. Gorillaz makes way too much money on merch alone. Why close that door? But if this was the note that Gorillaz wanted to end their story on, or trigger some sort of reboot or reset of continuity, that wouldn't surprise me either. They love trafficking in some of that winking ambiguity. But what does that make the lore of Gorillaz? Is it exaggerated, deconstructed parody with a bit of a narrative? Or with each passing album, does it become the mirror of the people behind the band, ambling their way towards answers and yet more questions? Is it the merchandising gift that will not stop giving? Or are all the silly cartoons representative of a world where all the painstaking effort in which to create art defines its enhanced value? And that story is going to matter in parallel alongside whatever Al Barn and the Motley Crue take them next. That the lore doesn't matter to the creator or the audience until it is the reminder of a time when it could afford to not matter. And while we can't get that time back, we can actually tell the story the lore is built to set up. I think you can enjoy both music and lore distinctly separate for their own reasons. Appreciate the moments when they interweave, and acknowledge that when it's more abstracted poetry linking the two together, it all feels so emotionally tenuous by the nature of the medium that's built to be. It doesn't mean it doesn't matter, but perhaps in a different way. And that's worth considering. I mean, for this mountain at least, we all might be heading to that same peak in the end. But for what matters, I mean, it's always going to be an uphill battle. Sometimes they're going to have to lose. It ain't about how fast they get there or what's waiting on the other side. It's the climb.